Welcome, friends, to another quiet journey into history. Tonight we begin a story filled with golden treasures, ancient mysteries, and whispers of curses that have echoed for a century. If you enjoy these calm, late-night explorations, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you'll never miss the next chapter. Now, let's step softly into the Valley of the Kings, where the desert keeps its secrets, and the boy king waits to be discovered. The desert in Egypt isn't quiet the way a library is quiet. It's louder than that. The sun hums, the sand hisses when the wind drags across it. And deep in the Valley of the Kings, where stone cliffs rise like baked walls of a giant oven, the silence feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. This was no ordinary stretch of desert. For centuries, people believed this place was a gateway between life and death, where kings tried to outsmart time itself. By the early 20th century, this valley already carried centuries of stories, some true, some twisted, and some that were probably made up by bored guides trying to impress tourists. Beneath the sand lay tombs built for pharaohs, Egypt's god kings, who wanted two things: to live forever and to keep their treasures forever. Spoiler alert, they managed neither. Grave robbers had plundered most tombs long before archaeologists showed up with their brushes and notebooks. Imagine being a king thousands of years ago. You've ruled a country, fought wars, bossed people around, built statues of yourself taller than a house. But deep down you're worried. What if, when I die, somebody steals my gold? What if they take my cool chariot or my favorite necklace? So you hire the best architects to hide your tomb in this desert valley, surrounded by cliffs like walls. You think, perfect, no one will ever find it. And yet people always do. Humans are nosy. The Valley of the Kings was chosen for one big reason: location, location, location. Those cliffs, they formed a natural pyramid shape, if you looked from a distance. Pharaohs loved pyramids. And hiding tombs here was cheaper, faster, and sneakier than stacking 2 million blocks of stone like at Giza. In theory, this was the perfect resting place. In reality, the tombs became Egypt's most tempting treasure chests. By the time the 1800s rolled around, the valley was less a secret graveyard and more like a playground for explorers with big hats and even bigger egos. Tomb walls had been hacked through, treasures stolen, and even mummies dragged out. Some locals told travelers that the dead weren't too happy about all this poking around. And when Egyptians say something with a straight face, it tends to stick with you, especially when it involves curses. For centuries, people had believed the ancient Egyptians left warnings in their tombs. Things like, "He who enters shall be struck down by crocodiles," or "May scorpions dance on your pillow." Okay, maybe not those exact words, but close enough. Even if the warnings were just poetry or symbolic threats, the idea that the dead could reach out from their golden coffins and slap you with bad luck was irresistible. The truth is, most curses in Egyptian tombs weren't written for tourists or archaeologists. They were meant for tomb robbers, regular guys from the neighborhood sneaking in at night to swipe some jewelry. Pharaohs wanted those thieves to feel nervous, maybe even turn around before grabbing a handful of gold. It was like the ancient version of a beware of dog sign, except instead of a barking dog, it was a god with a lion's head. By the time Europeans came with their shovels and dynamite, yes, dynamite archaeology was rough back then, the legend of the curse had already taken root. Some locals insisted that anyone disturbing the tombs would suffer strange accidents, sickness, or death. But of course, Western adventurers thought of themselves as too modern and scientific to worry about ghost stories. That bravado, as we'll see later, didn't age well. Still, before Howard Carter entered the scene, the Valley of the Kings looked more like a barren construction site than a holy graveyard. Sand dunes swallowed tomb entrances, broken pottery lay scattered, and every step stirred up dust that had been sitting there for thousands of years. It was easy to forget this was the burial place of mighty kings. Unless, of course, you stop to think about how much gold might still be hiding beneath your feet. And then came the whispers, the ones that made even the bravest explorers hesitate. Workers muttered about unseen hands tugging at their clothes, strange winds blowing through sealed tunnels, and shadows moving where no torch burned. Maybe they were exaggerating. Maybe the valley really was haunted. Either way, the stage was perfectly set. Before Carter uncovered his famous tomb, the Valley of the Kings already had all the ingredients of a ghost story. So picture it. The desert glowing orange at sunset, archaeologists brushing sweat off their brows, and locals shaking their heads, warning them to turn back. Everyone standing there knew this place wasn't ordinary. Beneath their boots lay a city of the dead, pharaohs dreaming of eternity, and curses waiting to be woken. They just didn't know how loud the world would soon be talking about those curses. Every great discovery needs a stubborn dreamer. And in the story of King Tut, that dreamer was a man named Howard Carter. Carter didn't look like the Hollywood version of an explorer. No tall hat, no charming smile, no whip like Indiana Jones. He was a quiet, sometimes cranky man who liked to draw things. He didn't come from wealth or noble birth. In fact, he started out as the son of a poor painter in England, sketching birds and animals for fun. Not exactly the resume you'd expect for the guy who would uncover one of the greatest treasures in human history. Carter's talent for drawing got him noticed. In the late 1800s, archaeologists in Egypt realized, hey, we need someone who can actually draw these hieroglyphs and wall paintings before they fade. Photography was still clunky back then, so having a steady hand and an artistic eye was golden. Carter was hired to copy ancient art, and he fell in love with Egypt right away. Imagine being a teenager walking into your first tomb, torch in hand, seeing colors painted thousands of years earlier, still glowing in the dark. That would ruin you for normal jobs forever. Carter wasn't just artistic, he was stubborn. Egyptology, the study of ancient Egypt, was full of well-dressed, well-funded gentlemen who treated it like a hobby. Carter didn't have their money or their titles, but he had grit. He was willing to sweat in the desert heat, dig until his fingers blistered, and argue with anyone who told him no. That stubborn streak often made him unpopular, but as history shows, sometimes it takes a little grumpiness to change the world. Of course, Carter couldn't chase his dream alone. Archaeology was, and still is, expensive. You needed workers, tools, supplies, and permission slips from Egyptian officials. That meant finding a rich sponsor. Enter George Herbert, also known as the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a wealthy English aristocrat with a taste for adventure. Carnarvon had the money but not the patience to actually do the digging himself. Carter had the obsession but not the funds. Together they were the perfect odd couple. The Run Terce began in 1907. Carnarvon bankrolled Carter's digs in the Valley of the Kings, hoping they'd find something spectacular. And they did find things: fragments, broken pottery, tombs already robbed centuries earlier. But Carter wasn't satisfied. He was convinced there was one tomb still hidden, one tomb that had escaped the grave robbers, the tomb of a boy pharaoh named Tutankhamun. Most scholars at the time thought Carter was wasting his time, but Carter wasn't the type to back down. Where did Carter get this wild idea? He'd studied lists of pharaohs, museum artifacts, and notes from earlier digs. Tutankhamun's name showed up on objects, but no one had found his tomb. It was like seeing someone's name on invitations but never spotting them at the party. Carter believed that Tutankhamun's burial place had to exist somewhere, still sealed, still waiting. He gambled his career and Carnarvon's fortune on that belief. For years Carter dug, and dug, and dug. Imagine the frustration. You're in the blistering sun, shoveling through sand, day after day, and all you find is an empty hole or someone else's broken tomb. Carnarvon began to lose faith. By 1922, after nearly a decade of searching, he told Carter, "One more season. If you don't find anything, we're done." That was Carter's do-or-die moment, and he knew it. Carter's obsession wasn't just about treasure, it was about proving himself. For years he'd been dismissed as too rough, too blunt, not refined enough to play with the gentleman scholars. Finding Tut's tomb would silence them all. It wasn't just about gold, it was about pride. Sometimes pride is heavier than any sarcophagus. He also had another motivation: mystery. The Valley of the Kings had given up most of its secrets, but not all. Tutankhamun was a pharaoh everyone had heard of but no one could place. His tomb, if found, might be the last intact royal burial. Imagine being the one person in history to pull open that door. Carter couldn't let that go. He was hooked. By late 1922, the tension was unbearable. Carnarvon was ready to pull the plug. Carter begged for one last chance. With crews digging in what looked like just another patch of desert floor, Carter paced, muttered, and hoped. He was gambling not just his career but his entire reputation. He'd staked everything on the belief that Tutankhamun was still waiting down there. Little did he know, the valley was about to reward or curse his obsession. Looking back, Carter's story feels almost like destiny. A poor kid with a sketchpad, chasing pharaohs across the desert, funded by a sickly English aristocrat, fueled by pride and obsession. The odds were against him, but obsession has a funny way of ignoring odds. The Valley of the Kings was about to surrender its most famous secret, and the world would never look at ancient curses the same way again. The morning was ordinary enough. Sun high, desert air dry as old parchment, when a worker's tool struck stone. Just another scrape in the endless digging of the Valley of the Kings. But this time the sound was different. Hollow. Carter leaned in. His crew brushed away sand and slowly a step appeared. A real staircase, cut into the bedrock, leading down. Carter's pulse quickened. He had been chasing this moment for years, and now the desert was finally whispering. Here it is. Carter's hands shook as he examined the first step. "Keep digging," he ordered. More sand was cleared and more steps revealed. Soon a whole staircase stretched down into the earth. At the base stood a plastered doorway, sealed tight, stamped with ancient symbols. This was no random shaft. This was a tomb. But whose? Carter didn't dare say it out loud yet. From Tree sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon in England. at last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. You can almost hear the relief in the clipped words. Carter had gambled everything, and now he had proof. Carnarvon immediately packed his bags. This was the moment they had both been waiting for. In late November 1922, Carnarvon arrived in Egypt, nervous but excited. Together, he and Carter descended the newly uncovered staircase. They reached the sealed door. The clay impressions bore the royal necropolis seal, a jackal above 9 bound prisoners. It screamed authenticity, and yet Carter worried. What if the tomb had already been robbed? What if the treasures were gone? He needed to see inside. Carter ordered a small hole chiseled into the plaster. He struck a match, held up a candle, and peered through the gap. His eyes widened. At first, the flickering flame made it hard to see. Then shapes emerged. Golden statues, strange animals, glittering objects stacked high, gleaming in the half-light. Carnarvon, impatient, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter whispered the words that would echo through history. "Yes, wonderful things." Imagine the sight. A room so packed with treasures it looked like a pharaoh had gone on the world's most extravagant shopping spree. Chariots, thrones, chests, statues of gods, furniture stacked like someone was moving into the afterlife. Every inch glittered with gold leaf, polished stone, and mysterious shapes wrapped in linen. This wasn't just wealth, it was history, untouched for over 3,000 years. The two men could hardly breathe. It wasn't just the heat or the dust, it was the weight of the moment. They were standing at the threshold of the most intact royal tomb ever found. For centuries, grave robbers had won, but not this time. Tutankhamun, the forgotten boy king, had managed to keep his secrets, until now. Word spread quickly. Journalists scrambled for the story. The world had been obsessed with Egypt for decades. Mummies, pyramids, hieroglyphs, and now here was the ultimate jackpot. The greatest archaeological discovery of all time, they called it. And they weren't wrong. Photos of the treasures would soon circle the globe, igniting Tutmania. But excitement wasn't the only thing creeping through the desert air. As Carter's team continued clearing rooms, locals whispered that such wealth must be protected by magic. Already, they claimed, strange accidents had begun around the site. Skeptics laughed. But Egypt had always been a land where myth and reality danced close together. The curse, once just a whisper, was about to take center stage. Standing there, staring at treasures no one had seen since the Bronze Age, Carter probably didn't care about curses. All he cared about was cataloging every last object, photographing every detail, and proving to the world that his obsession had been worth it. Yet even as he smiled, shadows seemed to linger just a little longer in the corners of that tomb. And so, with a candle, a crack in the wall, and a whispered phrase about wonderful things, the world entered a new chapter of fascination and fear. The Valley of the Kings had finally yielded its greatest prize. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't just archaeology, it was legend being born. The first time Carter peered through the hole, his candle flame flickering, the sight must have felt unreal. For a moment he probably thought his eyes were tricking him. Shapes rose out of the darkness. Animals, gods, golden furniture stacked like a pharaoh's attic. The room was so crammed it looked like a cosmic garage sale, except everything glittered like treasure from a dream. The first chamber was just an appetizer. Inside were couches shaped like animals, painted chariots, delicate boxes with lotus flowers carved on the sides. There were alabaster vases still sealed, their contents a mystery. Even the air felt thick, as if the room itself hadn't breathed since Tutankhamun's burial more than 3,000 years earlier. Carter must have realized this wasn't a broken, looted tomb like so many others. This one was different. Imagine standing there in the desert heat one moment, dust clinging to your skin, and then stepping into a space where time had stopped. Everything looked fresh, polished, untouched. It was like a pharaoh had just stepped out for lunch and might return at any moment. Carter later said the sight seemed to overstep the bounds of reality. In other words, it didn't feel real. At the far side of the antechamber stood 2 life-size statues of blackened wood, coated in resin, gleaming under torchlight. They were guardians, standing watch with spears, ready to protect their king. Their glass eyes seemed almost alive. Workers whispered nervously, convinced the statues weren't just decorations but protectors waiting for intruders. And behind those guardians was another sealed doorway, a second chamber. Carter's heart must have hammered in his chest. If the first room was this packed with treasures, what could be behind that next door? He was staring not just at wealth, but at mystery layered upon mystery. Every doorway was a page in a story waiting to be turned. The detail of the treasures overwhelmed even Carter. Chairs inlaid with ivory, beds shaped like lions, boxes painted with scenes of Tut's life. Everywhere he turned, there was something exquisite. This wasn't just gold piled up, it was art. The kind of art that made you realize the Egyptians didn't just bury their kings, they tried to recreate heaven itself in miniature right there in the tomb. Then came the sealed boxes, chests bound with cords, still knotted from ancient hands. What secrets lay inside? Food offerings, jewelry, weapons. Each box was a locked story, waiting for the archaeologists to carefully undo the strings. Imagine untying a ribbon that had been tied by someone more than 3,000 years ago. It's enough to make your fingers tremble. For Lord Carnarvon, the sight was overwhelming too. He had spent his fortune funding Carter, endured years of dust and disappointment. And now here it was, a room bursting with wonderful things, just like Carter had promised. The two men must have exchanged a look that said it all. Relief, triumph, awe. Their gamble had paid off. Roncaled the tomb, the world buzzed. Reporters demanded details, locals whispered of curses, and archaeologists lined up for a glimpse. But inside, Carter tried to stay focused. He insisted on cataloguing every object, photographing each treasure before moving it. It was painstaking work, but Carter knew they had stumbled on the find of the century, and history deserved patience. Carter later described the treasures as a strange and wonderful medley of extraordinary and beautiful objects. But that was an understatement. There were golden shrines, alabaster lamps, ceremonial daggers, and even board games meant for Tut to play in the afterlife. Every piece hinted at the boy king's short, mysterious life. The tomb wasn't just a burial, it was a biography told in gold and stone. And yet the biggest discovery still lay ahead. Beyond the treasures, past the guardians, behind the sealed doors, rested the innermost chamber, the burial chamber itself. Carter could only imagine what it held. If this outer room was so dazzling, then what lay with Tutankhamun's mummy? Carter probably knew in his gut. They had barely scratched the surface of this story. For now, though, Carter allowed himself to savor the moment. Wonderful things, he had said, and that phrase, simple but perfect, summed up the discovery. The tomb wasn't just gold, it was wonder itself. Wonder that had slept undisturbed for thousands of years, waiting for one man's obsession to bring it back into the light. The desert keeps secrets, but it doesn't keep them quietly. After Carter's wonderful things moment, the valley felt different. Workers spoke softer. Torches burned lower. You could blame it on fatigue or dust or the prickly feeling of being watched by two wooden guardians with glassy eyes. Either way, the air carried a rumor, like a thread pulled through cloth. There is a price for opening a king's door. Someone said a foreman tripped on a tool he swore he'd left in a different place. Someone else swore the desert wind changed direction the moment the seal broke. Tiny things. Nothing you could write in a logbook, but the mind loves patterns, and the valley offered plenty of blank spaces to draw on. Locals had their own way of saying be careful, old proverbs about angered spirits, quiet gestures toward the cliffs. One man traced a sign in the air as Carter walked past, a protective mark his grandmother taught him. To an English ear it all sounded superstitious, to an Egyptian one it sounded like respect. Different languages for the same feeling. This place matters. Don't treat it lightly. The newspapers, of course, smelled a better story in fear than in inventory lists. Ancient curse guard's boy king plays better than cataloguing proceeding methodically. Long before any big tragedies, reporters were already polishing headlines. A curse was the perfect cast member, invisible, dramatic, and available for interviews at any hour. People talked about inscriptions, sinister warnings promising death to tomb breakers. Truth is, Tutankhamun's outer doorway didn't have a giant neon sign saying turn back or else. Most Egyptian curses are poetic, symbolic, and not always in the areas tourists imagine. But in Rumorland, accuracy is optional. The line that stuck was short and sharp. Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king. Catchy, terrifying. Basically built for the front page. Inside the camp, Carter tried to keep it practical. Lists, sketches, photographs, conservation. He preferred facts to phantoms. But even he couldn't control what happened outside the trench. Cairo salons buzzed. Teacups clinked. Spiritualists nodded wisely. Letters arrived from strangers offering protection charms. A famous medium reportedly announced that the king's Ka, his life force, was restless. It seemed everyone had an opinion, including the dead. One tiny story fluttered through camp like a sparrow. Carter's canary. The tale goes that a cobra, royal symbol of the pharaoh, slithered in and killed the bird shortly after the discovery. A sign, some said, that the king had struck his first blow. Is it provable? Debated. Is it sticky? Absolutely. A canary in a coal mine makes a point. A canary in a pharaoh's camp makes a headline. Then there were the accidents. A splinter gone infected. A rolled ankle on a staircase that wasn't there yesterday. A fever that tucked someone into their cot for a sweaty, shivering night. Nothing deadly, nothing huge, but fear is excellent at bookkeeping. It tallies every odd cough and every candle that blows out at the wrong time. In the city, tour guides perfected the dramatic pause. Ladies and gentlemen, beyond those cliffs lies the resting place of, well, you've heard the stories. They sold postcards of golden masks and added a whisper, the curse is real. It wasn't malicious, just business. Egypt had gold in the ground and gold in the imagination, and both mined well. Meanwhile, the team in the tomb had a more practical worry: air. Sealed chambers can hold stale atmospheres, spores, molds, who knows what. Some workers tied cloth around their faces, others shrugged. You can't see microbes, which makes them less frightening than curses until the fever hits. The line between superstition and science narrows when you're coughing in the dark. Carter kept the pace steady. Measure, photograph, record, no rush, no shortcuts. But even he felt the pinch of the outside world. Reporters pushed for access. Rivals grumbled. Letters from armchairs poured in. Kind sir, do not open another door. As if history could be paused because someone had a bad dream in Surrey. Still, Carter read them. It's hard not to when the envelope says your work might doom you. In the half-light of the antechamber, two black guardian figures kept their eternal watch. Workers avoided eye contact with them. In that very human way we avoid eye contact with mannequins after dark. If a pick slipped or a crate creaked suddenly, every head snapped toward those statues. Rationally, everyone knew they were wood and resin. Emotionally, they were bouncers for a god king. A few days brought a few coincidences, always the fuel for a good curse. A beloved donkey went lame. A sand devil whipped through camp and knocked over a table filled with notes. A crate's rope snapped at the exact second someone joked about waking the pharaoh. If you're a skeptic, these are statistics. If you're a storyteller, they're plot points. The Valley of the Kings had discovered its genre. Back in Europe, seance rooms filled. A woman in black claimed Tut spoke to her in a dream, saying the earth was unbalanced. A gentleman swore his mantle clock stopped the moment the seal broke. None of this could be verified, but people didn't want verification. They wanted meaning, something glow in the dark to stick onto the unknown. The strangest part, the curse theory didn't need evidence, it just needed timing. Discovery, then rumor, then one big event to cement it. The world stood like a theater audience when the lights dim. Everyone knew something was coming, they just didn't know which door it would step through. Carter, for his part, trusted craft over fate. He had waited years for this. He wasn't about to turn back because a headline had teeth. He moved like a careful conductor. Lift this, pad that, note everything. If there was a curse, he would outwork it with pencils and patience. That was his superstition, the ritual of doing things right. And yet even the disciplined feel a tremor. At night, the cliffs press close, and the sky looks like a lid. Stories crawl into your tent and curl up near your ear. You tell yourself that tomorrow will be ordinary, then a jackal calls from somewhere in the wadi, and ordinary feels far away. The valley doesn't scare you, it reminds you. That's almost worse. The first chapter of the curse wasn't blood and thunder, it was tone. A mood stitched from half-seen things and well-told rumors. Every great legend starts as weather, clouds gathering at the edge of the map. In late 1922 and early 1923, the clouds stacked up. All they needed was a lightning strike. Ronkers still laughed, tea still boiled, crates still thumped into sledges, but even laughter sounded thinner. Somewhere between superstition and press release, the idea hardened. Meddling with royal sleep invites a reply. The valley had become a stage where everything meant two things, what it was, and what someone would say it meant in tomorrow's paper. And the rumor rolled on, down the slope to Luxor, across the Nile, up the rail lines to Cairo, onto ships, into cafes, and finally into drawing rooms, 2 continents away. Everyone loves a treasure, but a treasure with a warning label? That's irresistible. The world leaned closer, listening for the next footstep. Ron Robson var, enwigen belira, ariget visum psritit set, rutherwaring, condora for hab, conan, retivolva mupindix. Halistipal tort vi clubs expression and guidor, radially come for pifombo. Desviti spamton law bo megal war, picamdon mile in the lapalma, that in tom dequate compactu moning hingia kenstrom utual wall t, divided kota for t, supplied quite compuria frinski piditukaba, to mitutakokoles in tutakort. The first whispers of a curse weren't proof of anything, except that humans love a frame. We can't help it. When the desert gives us a hole in a door, we turn it into a keyhole for the imagination, and once you start peeking, it's hard to stop. The door to the burial chamber waited, so did history, and so according to the papers, did the curse.
Every legend needs a turning point, and for the curse of the pharaohs, it arrived in March 1923. Up until then, the curse was gossip, whispers in the desert wind, playful headlines, campfire nerves. But then something happened that snapped the rumor into shape. Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy backer of Carter's expedition, fell ill, and when a rich aristocrat who just opened a tomb dies suddenly, well, you can guess what the newspapers did with that. The story begins with something small, a mosquito bite, just an irritating little nip on Carnarvon's cheek. He probably didn't think much of it, but infections in the early 20th century could be tricky. Antibiotics weren't yet common, and small wounds sometimes grew into big problems. The bite became infected, spread, and soon turned into blood poisoning. Within days, Carnarvon was bedridden. Cairo doctors did what they could, but the infection worsened. Carnarvon grew feverish, delirious. Friends and family rushed to his side, including his daughter, Lady Evelyn. Reporters sniffed the scent of drama and crowded the hotels. Rumors spread faster than the bacteria in his blood. On April 5, 1923, Lord Carnarvon died. The official cause, pneumonia brought on by blood poisoning. The unofficial cause, at least according to the world's imagination, was the curse of King Tutankhamun. The timing was too perfect, too dramatic. Within hours, headlines screamed, "Pharaoh's curse claims first victim." The rumors got juicier. People claimed the lights went out in Cairo the exact moment Carnarvon died. Others said that back in England his beloved dog let out a howl and dropped dead the very same hour. Were these coincidences? Probably. But coincidence is the mother of legend. Rondreth's dog story in particular spread like wildfire. Carnarvon's fox terrier, they said, yelped once and fell lifeless at Highclere Castle, thousands of miles away. No telegrams, no witnesses, just a tale repeated enough times to sound true. It had everything a good ghost story needs: distance, timing, and a poor innocent animal. The Egyptian press leaned in. Spiritualists nodded knowingly. Western readers, already primed for exotic tales of curses, lapped it up. Carter, meanwhile, shook his head. He knew the truth. Carnarvon had been frail for years, his health weakened by a car accident long before Egypt. The desert hadn't cursed him, his body had betrayed him. Still, Carter's voice was drowned out by the roar of superstition. To make things even more delicious for the rumor mill, people pointed out the mosquito bite. Where was it? On Carnarvon's cheek, exactly where Tutankhamun's mummy had a wound. That detail sealed it for many believers. Coincidence? Or cosmic payback? Skeptics shrugged, but believers leaned in closer. Soon a list of victims began to grow. Anyone connected to the tomb who stubbed a toe or caught a cold suddenly became part of the curse tally. A French Egyptologist had a heart attack. Curse. A wealthy visitor got pneumonia. Curse. The Valley of the Kings wasn't just a dig site anymore, it was a stage for fear. Lady Evelyn, who had been with her father in Cairo, remembered the chaos of those days. Grief for her father, hounded by journalists demanding quotes about curses. Even in mourning, she became a character in the legend. The living had little privacy when the dead were writing the script. Back in England, polite society buzzed. Dinner tables hummed with debate. Surely it must be true. What else could explain it? Spiritualists held seance to contact Carnarvon. Newspapers competed with more dramatic headlines each day. In just a week, the curse of the pharaohs had transformed from rumor to worldwide sensation. Carter hated it. For him, the tomb wasn't about superstition, it was about science, about cataloguing and preserving. He knew Carnarvon had taken risks with his fragile health, but facts rarely win against mystery, and the mystery was now bigger than the man himself. Many had warned, disturbing a king's rest is dangerous. Now to them, the proof was plain. The foreign intruders had opened what should have stayed closed, and the king had answered. The idea of a curse wasn't silly, it was justice. The timing was eerie. Yes, but in truth, curses don't need actual magic, they need stories. Carnarvon's death was a story too perfect to resist. The man who bankrolled the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, dead within months, with mysterious coincidences swirling around him. Real or not, the curse had found its first victim, and once a legend has its first victim, it doesn't stop. Reporters sharpened their pencils. Spiritualists set their tables. The world leaned forward, breathless. The curse was no longer a whisper. It was a headline, a sermon, a fireside tale. It had become real, not in the tomb, but in the hearts of millions. Doms behind to hearts of millions. Carter pressed on with his work, ignoring the storm, but he must have felt the shift. The tomb was no longer just archaeology, it was theatre. Every crate lifted, every door opened, every photograph taken now carried a shadow. The boy king's tomb had been uncovered, but so too had something less tangible, the world's hunger for mystery. After Carnarvon's death, the world was hooked. One man's passing had been enough to make the curse feel real. But then came more stories, strange deaths, accidents, illnesses, that seemed to circle around Tutankhamun's tomb like vultures. Soon people weren't just asking if the curse existed, they were keeping score. He visited the tomb in 1923, marveled at the treasures, then shortly afterward developed a fever. Within weeks he was dead. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the press called it another strike for the curse. Next was Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, an Egyptian aristocrat. He too was linked to the tomb by visits and social ties. Not long after, he was shot dead in London by his wife in a scandalous case that filled tabloids. Was it murder? Yes. Was it tied to a mummy's curse?
Not logically, but logic rarely sells newspapers. Along came Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, a radiologist who took X-rays of Tut's mummy. Shortly after, he fell ill and died unexpectedly. Another tick on the curse's ledger. Now, even men of science, doctors, radiologists, scholars, were not safe. The story deepened. If you so much as touched Tutankhamun, the curse would find you. In 1929, he was found dead in his London bed under mysterious circumstances, some claiming it was smothering. His death fed the idea that the curse wasn't just a desert wind, it could reach across oceans. His father, Lord Westbury, grief-stricken, later died by falling from a London apartment window. People said he had been cursed too, his life broken by the weight of Tut's tomb. Even family members now seemed fair game for the curse's tally sheet. By the late 1920s, over 20 names were being whispered as victims of the curse. Some were true deaths, others were exaggerations or flat-out inventions. But once a list starts growing, nobody wants to be the one to erase names. Each fresh misfortune was another brick in the legend. The odd part, many of the actual archaeologists, including Carter himself, lived long lives. The curse, if real, seemed highly selective, striking aristocrats, visitors and socialites more than the men actually working in the dust. But that irony made it juicier. It was as if the pharaoh's wrath knew exactly where to strike for maximum drama. The media loved it. Every new obituary became a chance to reprint the golden mask, to remind readers that somewhere in the desert, a boy king's spirit was exacting revenge. Magazines ran illustrations of skeletal pharaohs, jackals prowling grave robbers, and ghostly mummies stalking British gentlemen through London fog. Tourists flocked to Egypt, hoping to see the Valley of the Kings for themselves, maybe even hoping to feel a shiver of the curse. Guides leaned into it, telling stories with perfect pauses, pointing to Tut's tomb and whispering, "Beware." What began as tragedy had become marketing. En route, seances grew popular again. Mediums claimed to channel voices of long-dead pharaohs. Tables tipped, candles flickered, messages were spelled out. Sometimes all it took was one loud creak in the wood for someone to gasp, "Tutankhamun is here." Carter, of course, was unimpressed. He wrote in his diary about how annoyed he was with the sensational press. To him, the real story was the treasures, the artistry, the history, but he couldn't undo the public's imagination. Once a curse catches fire, it burns hotter than any fact. Rubbisome sanctives fed the story. Scientists suggested mold spores or ancient bacteria might have sickened visitors. Doctors pointed out how fragile Carnarvon's health had been. But these rational explanations often made the curse sound stronger. After all, what's scarier, a ghostly hand, or invisible poisons floating through the air? The wave of tragedies didn't just cement Tut's legend, it changed archaeology itself. Suddenly, tombs weren't just history. They were mysteries, magnets for stories. And archaeologists became characters in an ongoing saga where every cough, every stumble could be interpreted as fate. By the early 1930s, the curse was global. In London, New York, Paris, wherever Tutankhamun's name was printed, people leaned forward, shivering. The boy king had ruled Egypt for less than a decade, but in death he ruled headlines for years. His curse became his crown. Still, the irony lingered. Carter, the man at the center of it all, lived for years after the discovery. He brushed off talk of curses with a scowl, but even he couldn't ignore that whenever another victim died, the whispers grew louder and the legend grew taller. Was it all coincidence? Likely. Was it exaggerated? Absolutely. But legends aren't built on numbers, they're built on feelings. And in the 1920s, people were ready to believe Tutankhamun had become more than a boy king. He was a storyteller from beyond the grave, and his audience was global. By the mid-1920s, the curse had grown legs and was sprinting through newspapers around the world. Every sniffle, stumble, or sudden death connected to Tutankhamun's tomb was labeled a victim. But while the headlines screamed, Howard Carter was frowning. He wasn't a showman. He wasn't a mystic. He was a stubborn, practical man who believed in hard work. And he was tired of ghosts stealing the spotlight. Carter's defiance began with routine. Each morning, while the world speculated about curses, he pulled on his boots, stepped into the valley, and went back to cataloguing. Treasures didn't care about gossip. They needed measuring, sketching, packing. That was his shield against superstition, lists and labels. He faced pressure from all sides. Reporters begged for quotes. Spiritualists sent letters offering to help appease the king's spirit. Even friends whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was something supernatural going on. Carter bristled. To him, this was nonsense that cheapened the work. "It's all tommy rot," he barked once, using an old-fashioned word for rubbish. Yet the pressure kept coming. Egyptian officials worried that the curse talk was stirring unrest among locals. British authorities worried about scandals hurting tourism. Even Carnarvon's death had become a diplomatic headache. Carter, caught in the middle, kept his chin down and his pencil moving.
If you picture Carter as fearless, think again. He wasn't immune to nerves. At night, alone in his tent, with jackals howling on the cliffs, even he must have felt the weight of the legends, but fear never kept him from work. Defiance for Carter wasn't loud speeches. It was showing up every day and refusing to stop. On runks, the treasures demanded patience. Each item was fragile, gold leaf peeled like old paint, wooden furniture cracked if lifted too quickly, linen crumbled at a touch. Carter's team became surgeons of history, using cotton pads, braces, and endless care. If curses existed, they were less dangerous than clumsy hands. He also had to battle politics. Egypt wanted its share of the discovery, while Britain insisted on control. Carter found himself arguing as much as digging. His blunt personality didn't help. He often offended officials with his sharp tongue. Still, his determination kept the project moving. Defiance wasn't just against curses, it was against bureaucracy too. Reporters, sensing his irritation, sometimes painted him as arrogant. But Carter wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing accuracy. He wanted Tutankhamun remembered for his treasures, not for tabloid horror. Still, the harder he pushed against superstition, the more the world seemed to cling to it. Through it all, Carter showed remarkable focus. Imagine kneeling in a hot tomb for hours, cataloguing a single bracelet or carving, while outside the press demanded drama. He ignored them, his notebooks filled with drawings and measurements, not ghost stories. That was his rebellion, silence in the face of noise. Ironically, Carter's refusal to play along only made the curse legends stronger. His gruff nonsense comments were printed alongside fresh obituaries, as if he were the lone voice denying an obvious truth. The more he resisted, the more the legends spread. He couldn't win, but he never stopped trying. What Carter did believe in was legacy. He knew Tutankhamun's tomb was unlike anything else, an intact royal burial, untouched by robbers. If superstition distracted from the scholarship, future generations might remember the ghost stories instead of the history. That thought infuriated him. As years passed, Carter endured setbacks. Funding arguments, health troubles, and endless negotiations slowed the work. But he stayed, stubborn as ever. He wasn't cursed, he was just tired. He once said, "I am only one of many who worked here." Yet without his grit, the tomb might still be hidden under sand. To Carter, defiance wasn't about denying ghosts. It was about honoring the past the right way. Every chest, every amulet, every broken jar deserved respect. He might not have believed in curses, but he respected the power of stories. And maybe, deep down, he knew, once unleashed, stories are harder to contain than sand. Decades later, Carter's defiance still echoes. While the world remembers curses and coincidences, historians remember his notebooks, his sketches, his catalogues. Without him, Tutankhamun might have remained a whisper in dusty scrolls. With him, the boy king became a household name. So the curse lived in headlines, but Carter lived in the valley, stubbornly brushing, sketching, lifting. He might not have believed in ancient magic, but he believed in work. And sometimes, that's its own kind of spell, stronger than superstition, louder than whispers. Up until now, the headlines had focused on curses, accidents, and Carter's stubbornness. But what about the boy at the center of it all? Tutankhamun wasn't just a golden mask or a mummy wrapped in linen. He was once a living child who walked palace halls, laughed at games, and tried briefly to rule a kingdom. To understand his tomb, we need to understand him. Tutankhamun was born around 1341 BCE during one of Egypt's most turbulent times. His father, most historians think it was Akhenaten, had turned the kingdom upside down, worshipping one god instead of many. Imagine being born into royal chaos, half the country angry, temples abandoned, priests furious. Tutankhamun became pharaoh as a boy, probably around 9 years old. 9, most of us at 9 were figuring out multiplication tables. He was figuring out how to wear the double crown of Egypt. Of course, he wasn't ruling alone. Advisors, priests, and generals made most decisions, but the crown sat on his head, and that crown was heavy, even for a child. His reign lasted only about 9 years, but in that time he played a crucial role, restoring the old gods. His father's experiment with one god, Aten, had collapsed. Tutankhamun reopened the temples, restored the priests, and brought back the familiar rhythms of Egypt's religion. It was as if the boy king's main job was to press reset on the empire's spiritual life. For all his importance, Tut's health wasn't strong. CT scans of his mummy show he had a clubfoot, scoliosis, and possibly malaria. He probably limped through palace halls, carried in a chariot more often than he walked. This fragile body inside royal robes reminds us, behind the gold he was still human. He married his half-sister Ankhesenamun. Yes, Egyptian royals often married close relatives to keep bloodlines pure. Together they tried to produce heirs, but no children survived. Archaeologists later found tiny mummies of 2 stillborn daughters in Tut's tomb.
silent evidence of heartbreak in a golden chamber. Tutankhamun died around age 18 or 19. That's it, barely an adult. The cause of death is debated. Some say an infection from a broken leg, others think malaria weakened him. Some even whisper murder, pointing to damage on his skull. The truth may never be known. What is clear is that his death was sudden and his burial rushed. The rush shows in his tomb. It's small compared to other pharaohs. Some think he was meant to be buried elsewhere but died too soon, so workers scrambled to finish a modest chamber. That may be why his tomb escaped detection. It was hidden, less grand, tucked away like an afterthought. Ironically, that afterthought became the most famous tomb of all. For centuries, Tutankhamun was forgotten. His name barely appeared on king lists. No towering temples bore his face. He was a footnote in Egyptian history. But sometimes forgotten things last the longest. Robbers overlooked his tomb. Sand covered its entrance. And so, when Carter found it in 1922, Tut was reborn, not as a footnote, but as the most famous pharaoh of all time. His golden mask became his second face, the one the world remembers. Calm eyes, perfect features, lapis and gold gleaming. But behind the mask lay the story of a sickly boy, a rushed burial, and a kingdom in transition. The contrast makes the mask even more haunting, perfection hiding fragility. Tutankhamun's story reminds us how history can be unfair. Great conquerors like Ramses or Thutmose built empires, but today many people know only Tut. Why? Because his tomb survived. Sometimes luck writes history more than deeds. Tut's legacy isn't what he did in life, but what he left behind in death. For Carter, peeling back Tut's story wasn't about curses. It was about giving voice to a boy lost in time. Each artifact spoke. A toy box, a chair, a pair of sandals. These weren't just treasures. They were Tutankhamun's personal belongings, the echoes of an ordinary teenager dressed in extraordinary gold. Think about it. Tutankhamun never knew his name would outlive Caesar, Napoleon, or Shakespeare. He never knew schoolchildren, a world away, would learn to spell his name before they could spell pharaoh. Sometimes history surprises us. The smallest candle burns the longest when it's hidden from the wind. So behind the mask isn't just a boy, it's a reminder that life can be short, that history can be fragile, that sometimes obscurity is the best protection. Tutankhamun didn't conquer lands or build giant pyramids, but he conquered time, and now he rules the imagination. Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't just a burial, it was a treasure chest, overstuffed and glowing with imagination. Carter once said the antechamber looked like an overstocked antique shop. Everywhere he turned there was gold, ivory, alabaster. It was as if Tut had been buried with everything he might ever need in eternity, and then some extras just in case. First, the golden shrines. Tutankhamun's burial chamber contained 4 gilded shrines, nested like giant Russian dolls, each one more ornate than the last, painted with scenes of gods guiding the boy king to eternity. Standing before them, Carter must have felt like he was peeling back the layers of a divine onion, each door unlocking another secret. And inside those shrines, a series of coffins, stacked one within another. The final coffin, solid gold, nearly 240 pounds of it. Smooth, gleaming, and shaped like the king himself. Imagine lifting the lid and realizing you're staring at a sarcophagus worth more than entire cities. But even the coffin wasn't the crown jewel. That honor went to the mask. Tutankhamun's funerary mask became the face of ancient Egypt itself. Gold, lapis lazuli, quartz, obsidian, metals and stones arranged with such perfection that even 3,000 years later, it still looks alive. Calm, beautiful, eternal. The mask wasn't just decoration. It was meant to protect Tutankhamun's spirit forever. Beyond the burial chamber, treasures filled the antechamber. Chariots with gilded wheels, some clearly for ceremony, others that looked ready to race across the desert sands. Tutankhamun may have been frail, but he was buried like a warrior, his chariots gleaming like thunderbolts for the afterlife. There were thrones too. One of them, inlaid with precious stones, shows Tutankhamun and his Anamun in a tender moment. She rubs oil on his shoulders, a scene of love frozen in gold and lapis. Amid all the grandeur, it's this chair that feels most human, a glimpse of affection carved into eternity. Weapons filled the tomb as well, bows, arrows, and daggers. One dagger had a blade made from iron that came not from Earth but from a meteorite. Imagine that. Tutankhamun carried a piece of the stars. The dagger still gleams as if sharpened yesterday, proof that sometimes the cosmos itself joins the story. There were musical instruments, trumpets of silver and bronze. In the 20th century, someone actually blew into one during a broadcast. The haunting notes echoed through radios around the world. Days later, World War II began. Coincidence? Probably. But once again, the boy king's belongings seemed to hum with mystery. The jewelry was endless. Necklaces with falcon pendants, scarabs carved from turquoise, broad collars of gold and colored glass, rings with hieroglyphs that looked sharp enough to slice paper. Tut was buried not just with wealth, but with identity, symbols of protection, love and power, all shining together. Even mundane objects became treasures. A folding stool, a board game called Senet, walking sticks carved with animal heads. Tut had dozens, likely because of his limp. These weren't just royal symbols, they were practical tools. Tut's tomb wasn't abstract, it was personal. Food and drink filled jars, honey, wine, barley, even meat. The boy king wasn't going hungry in the afterlife. Perfume jars, still holding faint scents after centuries, promised that he'd smell divine too. It's strange to imagine, open a jar and breathe in a fragrance last touched by a pharaoh. The sheer number of objects was overwhelming, over 5,000 artifacts in total. Carter's team spent nearly a decade cataloguing it all. Imagine spending 10 years just unpacking one teenager's closet. That's how overprepared Tutankhamun was for eternity. And yet the treasures weren't just glitter. They told a story of a boy who limped through palaces, who played board games, who wore golden sandals over fragile feet, who married young and who died too soon. The gold was dazzling, but the humanity behind it glowed brighter. Today, when Tutankhamun's treasures tour the world, millions line up to see them. They lean close to the glass, marveling, whispering. Some think about curses, some about glory, but most simply stare, caught by the same wonder Carter felt that day in 1922. Yes, wonderful things. The Valley of the Kings was hot, dusty and silent. But the story of Tutankhamun's tomb didn't stay there. It traveled, spreading like wildfire through newspapers, novels, films, and even comic books. The discovery wasn't just history anymore. It was entertainment. The curse had become a character of its own, starring in stories all around the world. Newspapers had been the first to feast on the curse. They loved the drama of Carnarvon's death, the whispers of strange coincidences, and the image of angry gods reaching out across time. Headlines grew bolder by the day. Pharaoh's curse strikes again. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was selling copies, and the curse was the best salesman they'd ever had. Then came novels. Writers jumped on the bandwagon, spinning stories of mummies rising from tombs, curses that haunted explorers, and jewels that carried death to anyone who wore them. These weren't scholarly works. They were thrillers, fun, spooky, and perfect for readers craving a chill before bed. By 1932, Hollywood had joined the party. Universal Pictures released The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff. It wasn't really about Tutankhamun, but it didn't matter. The film's story of a cursed priest rising from the dead blended perfectly with the public's imagination. Wrapped bandages, glowing eyes, eternal love. Suddenly, The Mummy became a horror icon. The movie was a hit, and the image stuck. From then on, whenever people thought of Tutankhamun, they thought of mummies walking at night, tombs that punished the greedy, and curses written in hieroglyphs no one should read aloud. A sickly boy king had somehow become the godfather of horror. Comic strips and radio dramas joined in. The curse became a joke, a mystery and a thrill all at once. One week, a mummy chased detectives through London alleys. The next week, a cursed scarab jewel haunted a socialite's necklace. Tut's tomb had turned into a bottomless pit of spooky inspiration. Even fashion got in on the act. The Art Deco movement loved Egyptian motifs, lotus flowers, scarabs, falcons. Jewelry designers copied pieces straight from Tut's tomb, selling pharaoh chic to wealthy ladies in New York and Paris. Ancient Egypt wasn't just history, it was style. Spiritualists also cashed in. Mediums claimed to channel Tut's spirit in seances. Ouija boards spelled out cryptic warnings. Candles flickered as messages came through from beyond. Whether you believed or not, it was good business. A little fear is profitable, especially when it comes in gold wrapping. The curse seeped into music halls and stage plays. Entertainers poked fun at it, mixing comedy with spookiness. One British review even sang a silly tune about pharaohs rising to complain about rent prices. The legend was elastic. It could scare, charm, or make people laugh depending on the night. Later, when Tutankhamun's treasures toured museums in the 1960s and 70s, the curse resurfaced in headlines again. Every time a crate was moved or an accident happened, someone whispered, "The curse has followed." Visitors lined up for hours, drawn not only by the glitter of gold but by the chill of superstition. Even modern movies kept the mummy alive. From horror classics to goofy comedies, Tutankhamun's legacy became part of pop culture's DNA. Each time a bandaged figure shuffled onto the screen, the boy king's tomb echoed in the background, whispering, "Remember me." Tutankhamun himself had been a fragile boy who likely struggled with daily life. Yet in pop culture he became larger than life, immortal, unstoppable, a symbol of fear and fascination. His mask was calm, but the stories it inspired were wild. The curse's popularity says less about Tut and more about us. We love stories that mix history with danger. We like to think that some doors should never be opened, even when curiosity pries them apart. The curse gave people what they craved, a thrill that felt ancient and inevitable. Over the years, the legend became almost playful. Cartoons showed mummies chasing kids. Halloween costumes wrapped people in toilet paper. The pharaoh's wrath had gone from feared to funny, but behind the jokes, the original story still pulsed. Somewhere in Egypt, a real boy had been buried in gold, and his memory refused to stay buried. The curse of King Tut wasn't real, not in the magical sense, but in the cultural sense. It was unstoppable. It cursed us with fascination. Once Carter cracked that doorway, the world was never free of Tutankhamun again. He became part of our imagination forever, wrapped in linen and lit by candlelight. By the 1930s, the curse had become a runaway train. Every death near Tutankhamun's circle was added to its tally, and every accident seemed suspicious. But scientists and doctors had their own ideas. They weren't hunting ghosts. They were hunting germs, toxins, and probabilities. Could the curse have a natural explanation? First came the idea of bad air. Tombs sealed for thousands of years might trap something nasty inside. Mold spores, bacteria, even toxic gases. When Carter's team cracked open those sealed chambers, they weren't just releasing treasure. They might have been breathing in an ancient cocktail of spores and dust. In fact, modern studies show that certain molds like Aspergillus niger can cause fever, coughing, or worse when inhaled. One researcher suggested that Carnarvon's already weak immune system might have been overwhelmed by exactly this. The curse wasn't supernatural, it was microbial. Tutankhamun's tomb contained food offerings, meats and oils sealed for millennia. Imagine opening a jar of leftovers that had been sitting around for 3,000 years. Not exactly safe. Some scientists think Carnarvon's infected mosquito bite might have worsened because bacteria from the tomb got into his bloodstream. Then there's the environment itself. The Valley of the Kings is brutally hot by day, bone-chilling by night. Work was exhausting, hydration scarce, medical care limited. Many so-called victims were wealthy visitors or older scholars whose health was already fragile. The tomb didn't kill them, life did. But science doesn't explain everything, at least not neatly. People noticed strange coincidences. Carnarvon's wound matched a mark on Tutankhamun's mummy, a blackout in Cairo the night of his death, a dog howling in England. Are these explainable? Yes. Are they dramatic? Absolutely. The human brain loves drama more than charts. Skeptics also point to the survival of Carter and most of his team. If a curse were real, why would the man who spent the most time inside the tomb live nearly 2 decades afterward? Carter died of natural causes in 1939, well into his 60s, not exactly the fate of a cursed man. En route, in fact, a study in the 2000s looked at the lifespan of everyone associated with Tutankhamun's tomb. If there was a curse, it was apparently generous. En route, and yet despite the data, the legend endured. Why? Because fear is easier to believe than fungus. A headline saying Pharaoh's curse strikes again is more exciting than researcher possibly had mold allergy. People don't stay up at night worrying about mold. They stay up worrying about curses. Even Carter himself, though dismissive, admitted the tomb had a strange atmosphere. Stale air, eerie silence, long shadows cast by lamps. Science can explain the ingredients but not the feeling, and feelings once stirred become stories. On Ron, modern technology continues to investigate. DNA tests on Tut's mummy suggest he had malaria and congenital disorders. CT scans revealed his injuries. Forensics shows us a fragile teenager, not a cosmic avenger. But still, when scientists publish their reports, headlines sneak in the word curse, because the myth is stronger than the microscope. The truth is, both sides matter. Science explains how mold spores or infections might harm. Superstition explains why people cared so deeply. One gives reasons, the other gives meaning. Together they tell the full story of why Tutankhamun still haunts us. That death is universal. That time humbles kings and explorers alike. Mold, mosquitoes, or myth. Take your pick. The curse is really about how humans read the world around them and how much we crave mystery in the cracks of reality. Carter fought the superstition with notebooks. Scientists fought it with microscopes, but storytellers embraced it with open arms. In the end, both the curse and the science survived, walking hand in hand, and perhaps that's fitting. Tutankhamun himself was both real and myth, a boy and a legend. So was the curse real? Not in the magical sense, but in the cultural sense. It was unstoppable. Fear became contagious, and fascination followed. Science may explain,
but stories enchant, and enchantment lasts longer. The real curse was curiosity itself. By the late 1920s, the Valley of the Kings had quieted down. The initial frenzy of discovery, the headlines of curses, the parade of visitors, all began to thin, but Howard Carter remained. The boy who had once sketched tomb paintings was now a middle-aged man, still cataloguing, still brushing sand off treasures, still fighting bureaucracy with his trademark stubbornness. Each one needed to be documented, drawn, photographed, and carefully stored. Carter had promised the world that this discovery would be done properly, not hastily, and he kept that promise, even as years rolled by. But the glamour faded. Visitors still came, but fewer. The cursed stories lost their sharp edge, becoming campfire tales more than news. Meanwhile, Carter wrestled with officials from Egypt's Antiquities Service. Tensions ran high. Who owned the treasures, Britain or Egypt? Carter often found himself in the middle, his blunt temper making negotiations worse. His relationship with Lord Carnarvon's family also grew complicated. After Carnarvon's death, Lady Evelyn drifted away from the work. The partnership that had made history slowly dissolved into arguments over rights and recognition. Carter, always prickly, didn't bend easily. Rontreg, financially, Carter never became rich. He was paid for his work, yes, but he didn't profit from the treasures. He wasn't a wealthy adventurer, just a determined man with a shovel, a sketchbook and a temper. Ironically, while the world thought of golden riches, Carter himself scraped by modestly. His health began to decline. Years in the desert sun, breathing dust, enduring stress, it all took its toll. By the 1930s, he was a man worn down by work and by the constant tug-of-war over Tutankhamun's legacy. Yet he remained fiercely protective of Tutankhamun. He bristled when journalists asked about curses, preferring to redirect to the artistry of the treasures. He wanted the boy king remembered for beauty, not for headlines. In this way, Carter was almost fatherly, guarding Tut's dignity against a noisy world. Recognition came slowly. He gave lectures in America and Europe, where crowds marveled at his slideshows of treasures. But he was no showman. His voice was flat, his manner stiff. People came for Tut, not for Carter. He was the key that opened the lock. But once the door swung wide, the spotlight moved on. In his quieter moments, Carter returned to painting and sketching, the skills that had started his journey. His notebooks filled with precise drawings of jewelry, shrines, and masks. The artist in him never left. He may have been too gruff for parties and too stubborn for politics, but he always had patience for line and shadow. By the late 1930s, Carter was living mostly in London, his desert years behind him. He never married, never had children. Tutankhamun was, in a way, his family. The boy king had given him purpose, fame, and frustration. Their lives had been braided together across 3,000 years. In 1939, Carter's health gave out. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a type of cancer. On March 10th of that year, he died at age 64. The man who had uncovered wonderful things slipped quietly from the stage. His funeral was modest. Few attended. No grand headlines marked his passing. On his grave, the epitaph reads, "May your spirit live, may you spend millions of years, you who love Thebes, sitting with your face to the north wind, your eyes beholding happiness." It was a line from an ancient Egyptian text, fitting for the man who gave us Tutankhamun. After all, wasn't he the man who had spent the most time in Tutankhamun's tomb? The supposed curse should have taken him first. Instead, he lived nearly 2 decades after the discovery. The curse, it seemed, had spared its greatest trespasser, or perhaps Carter's defiance had been stronger than superstition. Today, historians see Carter as complex, brilliant, stubborn, sometimes abrasive, but always dedicated. Without him, Tutankhamun would still be hidden. With him, the boy king became immortal. Carter may not have sought fame, but he couldn't escape it. Like Tut, his life became legend. In the end, Carter's final years remind us that history isn't just about kings and curses. It's about the people who guard the past, who peel back the sand one careful brushstroke at a time. Carter lived and died quietly, but his discovery roared across centuries, carrying both wonder and whispers. That was his true legacy. Howard Carter was gone, but the story he unearthed refused to rest. Tutankhamun's tomb didn't just belong to Egypt anymore. It belonged to the imagination of the world. And while Carter's notebooks closed, the cursed legend kept turning pages. Every generation seemed to add new victims, new coincidences, new whispers of pharaohs reaching across time. Archaeologists, museum staff, even visitors who touched artifacts became characters in the ongoing curse saga. It didn't matter if science had explanations. The story worked better with shadows. One tale told of Sir Bruce Ingram, a friend of Carter's. Carter once gave him a paperweight made from a mummified hand.
adorned with a scarab bracelet. Soon after, Ingram's house burned down. When he rebuilt, it flooded. Was it coincidence? Almost certainly. But to storytellers, it was another curse strike. In the 1960s and 70s, when Tutankhamun's treasures toured the world, the curse got new life. In Paris, in London, in the United States, huge crowds gathered to see the golden mask, lines stretched for blocks. And whenever a worker stumbled, or a light bulb burst, or a curator fell ill, whispers spread the curse had travelled with the treasures. Gamal Mehrez collapsed and died shortly after overseeing the opening of Tutankhamun's exhibition in Cairo. The press barely hesitated before declaring him another victim of the curse. Rationally, it was a tragic medical event, but narratively, perfect timing. Even accidents outside the museum walls were dragged into the legend. A car crash here, a sudden illness there. If a person had even a remote connection to the treasures, the curse got the credit. Tutankhamun had become a global ghost, haunting headlines from Cairo to California. Tourists leaned into it. Guides in Luxor would tell visitors, "Be careful, the pharaoh still watches." Some guests laughed nervously, others swore they felt chills in the tomb. Even skeptics carried the story home. The curse had become the valley's unofficial tour guide. Hollywood and television never let the legend go. From horror films to documentaries, the curse kept showing up. Each new retelling layered fresh details, sometimes invented, sometimes borrowed. In these stories, Tut wasn't just a boy king anymore. He was an immortal figure of dread, haunting the screen as much as the sands. In the 1970s, when Tut's treasures arrived in the US, the exhibition became a cultural phenomenon nicknamed Tut Mania. Millions poured through museums, shops sold Tut souvenirs, t-shirts, posters, even lunchboxes. And yet, tucked among the glitter and consumerism, whispers of the curse clung like cobwebs. In 1978, comedian Steve Martin even performed a song on Saturday Night Live called King Tut, poking fun at the craze. People danced and laughed, but even parody kept the legend alive. Tutankhamun wasn't just a pharaoh anymore. He was pop culture, part of the world's language. Of course, scientists rolled their eyes. They pointed out that thousands of people had handled Tutankhamun's treasures without incident. No mysterious plagues wiped out museum staff. No lightning bolts struck careless tourists. But science doesn't always win the crowd. Curses are easier to tell than statistics. And still, every so often the curse would flare. A random death, an accident during transport, a cracked artifact, each became fuel. The boy king's tomb was like a candle that never burned out. It didn't matter that Carter had lived long, or that data showed no curse at all. The story kept breathing. Honor and truth, the curse had become less about Tutankhamun and more about us. About how humans crave mystery, how we love to dress the unknown in robes of fear. Tut was no longer just a pharaoh. He was a mirror, showing us our fascination with life, death, and what lies between. And so the curse lived on, not in coffins or hieroglyphs, but in headlines, films, and imagination. Tutankhamun became the boy who never rested, his name forever tied to golden splendor and whispered warnings. Some kings rule armies. Tut ruled stories. The story of Tutankhamun began in silence, sand covering a forgotten tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Then came Carter's lantern, Carnarvon's death, and decades of whispers about curses. Now, a century later, the boy king's name still echoes, not because of armies or monuments, but because of the mystery wrapped around him like linen. The mystery is eternal because it balances perfectly between history and legend. On one side, science, archaeology, careful notes, CT scans, DNA tests. On the other, curses, ghosts, strange coincidences, and stories told by candlelight. Tutankhamun's legacy sits in that tension, half fact and half wonder. People still debate the curse. Was it mold spores in the air? Was it coincidence strung into story? Or was it something more, something intangible, born from the human need to believe that the past can still touch us? No microscope can measure awe. No chart can explain why hearts still race at the thought of a boy king's warning. Tutankhamun himself remains elusive. A teenager with a limp, thrust into power, dead before 20. He should have been a footnote. Instead, his small rushed tomb became the most famous in the world. If that isn't a kind of curse or blessing, it's certainly irony. His treasures tour the world, drawing millions. In quiet museum halls, people line up to stare through glass, whispering as if afraid to disturb him. They don't just see gold, they see mystery reflected back in their own eyes. That's Tut's true power. Not what he did, but what he makes us feel. And the curse? It doesn't strike with fevers or lightning bolts. Its real work is subtler. The curse is curiosity. Once you hear the story, you can't shake it. You wonder, what if there is something more? What if the dead still whisper? What if opening the tomb wasn't just archaeology, but trespass? For Egyptians, the curse became a kind of justice, an echo of warnings carved in stone long ago. Do not disturb the eternal rest. For Westerners, it was adventure, a brush with the supernatural. For everyone, it was a reminder that death is both final and unfinished, silent yet still speaking. 100 years on, Tutankhamun is more famous than ever. His mask is instantly recognizable. His name, once erased from history, is now taught in classrooms around the globe. That is the strangest curse of all, that a forgotten boy became immortal, not by conquest but by accident. And so the mystery lives eternal. Each new exhibition, each fresh book or film breathes life into him again. Tutankhamun doesn't rest. He keeps waking century after century, summoned not by priests but by curiosity. His tomb may have been sealed once, but his story never will be. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that curses exist, but that stories are stronger than stone, sand buries, time erases. But a good story told enough times lives forever. Tutankhamun is proof. He was a boy who died young, yet he will never die in memory. When Carter first peered into the tomb, he whispered he saw wonderful things. He couldn't have known that those wonderful things weren't just artifacts. They were stories, waiting to be retold, stories that would wrap the world in both awe and unease, stories that still make us wonder before we fall asleep. Tutankhamun will never be forgotten, not because of curses, but because of curiosity. We keep asking questions, and each answer opens another door. That's how legends live, not through fear, but through fascination, and fascination is eternal. Cronso, so tonight as the world drifts into sleep, the boy king still walks the halls of imagination. He limps, perhaps, leaning on his cane, but he carries the weight of gold and the silence of ages, and behind him trail the whispers of a curse that will never die, not because it kills, but because it enchants. The sands may shift, the Nile may rise and fall, new discoveries will come, new tombs uncovered, but Tutankhamun will always be there, smiling from behind his mask, eternal, patient, and luminous. His story is no longer his, it is ours, and perhaps that is the final mystery, that a boy who should have been forgotten instead became unforgettable. Not even time could bury him. Tutankhamun, the boy behind the mask, the king with no heirs, lives forever in legend. That is no curse, that is immortality.